To remove and install the rear drive shaft on your RZR XP, follow these steps. Park the vehicle on a flat level surface, ensure it is in park, and remove the key. Next, loosen the lug nuts while the vehicle is on the ground, but do not remove at this time. Next, remove and discard the cotter pin. Continue by loosening the castle nut. Then safely elevate the vehicle. Reference your owner's manual for proper lifting techniques. Once safely elevated, remove the lug nuts and set aside. Then remove the wheel and set aside. Then remove and retain the brake line cover fasteners and remove the cover. Next, remove and discard the brake caliper fasteners and remove the brake caliper from the brake disc. Carefully remove the caliper from the hub and support it with a wire hanger, rope, or retention strap to avoid damaging the brake line. Continue by removing and discarding the castle nut and cone washer. Next, remove the wheel hub assembly from the bearing carrier. A puller tool may be required to remove the bearing carrier. Next, remove the bolts, washers, and nuts for the upper and lower radius rods. Discard the nuts. While supporting the trailing arm from underneath, remove the lower shock mounting bolt and nut. Discard the nut. Support the trailing arm with a suitable jack stand or support. Then, remove the stabilizer bar mount bolt and nut. Discard the nut. After this, lift the rear end of the trailing arm assembly so the rear drive shaft is parallel with the ground. Next, support the drive shaft with one hand while removing the trailing arm assembly outward to remove the drive shaft from the bearing carrier. Then, lower the trailing arm. With a short, quick pull motion, remove the drive shaft from the transmission splines. Next, clean the anti-seize off the axle splines using a clean shop rag. Then inspect the threads and splines on the axle for nicks or burrs and replace if needed. Continue by inspecting the CV boots to ensure there are no cuts, wear, or damage, and replace if needed. Then inspect the drive shaft for wear, cracks, or other damage and replace if necessary. Next, remove and discard the compression ring on the drive shaft. Then install a new compression ring into the groove on the end of the drive shaft and ensure it is fully seated. Next, put anti-seize on the transmission end splines of the drive shaft and put the drive shaft in the transmission. If necessary, use a rubber mallet to tap the outboard end of the drive shaft. After this, put Loctite 7649 on the hub assembly splines, allowing 90 seconds for the primer to dry. While supporting the trailing arm from underneath, swing the rear trailing arm assembly outward and upward to a position where the rear drive shaft can be put into the bearing carrier. Then insert the lower stabilizer bar linkage into the trailing arm and loosely secure with a new nut. Continue by aligning the shock with the mounting holes on the trailing arm. Then reinstall the retained lower shock fastener from the outside and loosely secure with a new nut. Then torque the rear stabilizer bar linkage nut to specification. Continue by torquing the rear shock mounting fastener to specification. Next, install the upper and lower radius rod bolts, washers, and new nuts. Torque to specification. Then install the wheel hub assembly on the bearing carrier. Be sure to remove any straps or supports used. Then install a new cone washer and castle nut. Ensure that the cone washer is installed with the domed side out. Then carefully slide the caliper assembly onto the brake disc, ensuring the brake rotor is between the two pads. Next, install new brake caliper fasteners and torque to specification. Before continuing, ensure any items used to secure the brake caliper are removed from the wheel well. After this, reinstall the brake line cover and retain fasteners. Torque to specification. Next, reinstall the wheel on the vehicle and tighten the lug nuts until fully seated. Then safely lower the vehicle until the tires begin to touch the ground. This will help keep the wheel in place when torquing. Once lowered, torque the lug nuts to specification in a crisscross pattern. Then torque the wheel hub castle nut to specification. Then install a new cotter pin. Finally, lower the vehicle completely. For more information, see your authorized Polaris dealer or visit Polaris.com.